Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication is a secure way to manage access to your Azure SQL databases using Azure Active Directory identities. To get started with Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication, you need to create an Azure Active Directory and add users or groups to it. First, you need to create an Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal. After creating the Azure Active Directory, you need to create a service principal or managed identity for your Azure SQL database. This will enable your Azure SQL database to authenticate with Azure Active Directory. Next, you need to configure Azure Active Directory authentication for your Azure SQL database. You can do this by setting the Azure Active Directory admin for your Azure SQL server in the Azure portal. Once you have set the Azure Active Directory admin, you can connect to your Azure SQL database using Azure Active Directory Authentication. To connect to your Azure SQL database using Azure Active Directory Authentication, you need to use a compatible driver such as the ODBC or JDBC driver. You also need to have the Azure Active Directory Authentication enabled on your Azure SQL server. Best practices for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include using least privilege access and regularly reviewing and updating your Azure Active Directory configuration. You should also use multi-factor authentication to add an additional layer of security to your Azure SQL database. In addition, you can use Azure Active Directory groups to manage access to your Azure SQL database. This allows you to easily manage access to your database by adding or removing users from the group. Overall, Azure SQL Active Directory Authentication is a powerful tool for managing access to your Azure SQL databases. By following these tips and best practices, you can securely and efficiently manage access to your Azure SQL databases using Azure Active Directory identities. Key benefits of Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include centralized identity management, simplified access management, and enhanced security. With Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, you can easily manage access to your Azure SQL databases and ensure that your data is protected. In summary, Azure SQL Active Directory authentication is a secure and efficient way to manage access to your Azure SQL databases. By creating an Azure Active Directory, configuring Azure Active Directory authentication, and following best practices, you can ensure that your Azure SQL databases are secure and easily accessible to authorized users.